charges of first-degree murder. There's no bond on either of those charges.
56-year-old Louis Gaskin was dubbed the Ninja Killer after the murders in 1989.
He's got to be some kind of a crazy person to do something like that.
Was Mr. Gaskin acting under a delusional belief system in that he believed he was a ninja?
And he changed his story and said that Richard Glossop had paid him to carry out the murder.
Just in a letter, and I met with him yesterday. The nature of what we talked about.
Have to assume that if the state supports it, that the Supreme Court will support it, and so we will.
Lavinia sounds like such a lovely name. This story has nothing to do with grace or charm. Smile Wayfarer House was a pleasant place.
Florida's ninja slayer, Louis Gaskin, was put down after committing a gruesome crime that landed him behind bars and eventually on the row. Let's dive into the life and crime of Gaskin. The tragic night. On the night of November 20, 1989, Louis Gaskin dressed for a slaughter. He planned to slay and pillage and wore a black ninja costume to blend in with the night. Ninjas are trained assassins, he later told police in a detailed confession, and Gaskin's dream was to be a ninja slayer.
The execution took place without incident.
56-year-old Louis Gaskin was dubbed the Ninja Killer after the murders in 1989.
The sentence of the state of Florida versus Louis Bernard Gaskin was carried out at 6:15 p.m.
As he walked out the door of his home, he had armed himself with a .22 caliber rifle. The unsuspecting victims of his dark fantasy lounged in the den of their Palm Coast, Florida home watching television. Robert Sturmfels, 56 years old, had settled into his recliner while his wife Georgette, 55, sat on the sofa. They'd never heard of the career criminal who was about to end their lives. Gaskin drove aimlessly through the darkness, searching for a target. When he passed 10 Ricker Place, he saw a light shining through a patch of woods. Parking his car beneath a grove of trees, he moved silently towards the house. He stood for long moments in silence, watching, scoping it ninja style. Then he circled the house. Once, twice, 6 times. Gaskin fancied himself a warrior moving in for the hunt. Looking through the den window, he had a clear shot. He raised the rifle to his shoulder, aimed and fired. Robert felt the bullet smash into his chest and came up out of his chair. Gaskin fired again. This time Robert collapsed onto the floor. It took Georgette a few seconds to realize what was happening. She leaped out of her chair and began running toward the hallway. A bullet took her down. Robert somehow stood again and began to stagger away. A third shot hit him in the back and he fell again. Georgette, bleeding heavily from a back wound, crawled down the hallway out of Gaskin's sight. He circled the house until he came to a set of French doors. There, he saw Georgette struggling to get to her feet. He fired once more and she crumpled to the floor.
For the second time in just a span of 7 weeks, Louis Gaskin was nicknamed the Ninja Killer. Florida's death chamber will be used to exact the ultimate punishment on a convicted killer. On December 20th, 1989, for stalking his Central Florida victims wearing all black, were murdered with a .22 caliber gun inside their Palm Coast home. Robert and Georgette Sturmfels, their bullet-riddled house, burglarized.
Gaskin inhaled the cool Florida air. Of all the many crimes he'd committed, burglary, robbery, selling and using drugs, physically exploiting children, he said this was the most exciting to him. He pulled a hunting knife and slashed a window screen at the back of the house. Unlatching the window, he entered. He reloaded his gun, walked over to Robert and shot him in the back of the head. Then he placed the barrel of the rifle against the back of Georgette's head and blew her brains out. Gaskin knew that the nearest house was a quarter of a mile away, so he relaxed as he gathered up items he could sell: jewelry, VCRs, lamps, a clock, and iron household appliances. He looked for guns and drugs but found none. He checked Georgette's purse but found only credit cards. Robert's wallet contained $300 and more cards, so he took it. Gaskin placed the items in the victim's truck. He then drove through the woods to his own car where he transferred his loot. As he drove away, he left the bodies of 2 innocent victims inside the silent house. But Gaskin wasn't done. He'd spied a second secluded house just down the road. Joseph and Mary Rector had watched the 11 o'clock news and were on their way to bed when they heard a thump outside. Joseph investigated but saw nothing. The noises continued. Court documents state that after hearing a similar noise for a third time, Rector told his wife to call the sheriff. Mrs. Rector soon discovered that their phone was not working. They took the phone into the bedroom, where they tried plugging it into another jack without success. As he stood in the dark bedroom, Rector saw his window shade appear to explode. He looked down, saw blood, and realized he had been shot. The Ninja Slayer had thrown rocks and logs against the house, to get his victims to come into view so he could shoot them. Robert and Mary rushed out of the house and climbed into their car. Robert needed to get to a hospital. As they screeched out of the driveway, more shots rang out and the Rectors heard bullets thudding into the car. With Mary driving, they were able to reach the hospital and call police. Detectives arrived at the Rector home. It had been ransacked. As they continued their investigation, a postal carrier noticed a broken window at the Sturmfels home and reported it. There, cops found the bodies of Robert and Georgette.
On the same night, he committed an armed robbery, burglary, and attempted murder of another couple. He discussed concerns that evidence of his mental illness was not given to the jury before it recommended death.
He directed deputies to a pond where he dumped evidence in several crimes. Gaskin was arrested less than 2 weeks after the murders. The same night of the murders, Joe and Noreen Rector were attacked and robbed. Joe shot in the chest.
It's going to be Rector's.
I think he should die for what he did.
After burglarizing the Rector home, Gaskin drove to Alfonso Golden's home. He asked his cousin to store the stolen items for him. Golden agreed. Gaskin volunteered that he'd jacked the loot and told Golden that the victims are stiff. If you don't believe it, Gaskin bragged, watch the news. Golden, who also had a police record, waited a few days but eventually contacted police. Gaskin was arrested and quickly gave a detailed confession.
Gaskin on the charges of first-degree murder. There's no bond on either of those charges.
Louis Gaskin was convicted of shooting and killing a couple in 1989 inside their Flagler County home. Gaskin confessed to the crimes, but filed numerous appeals over the years.
He led authorities to a canal where he'd hidden the credit cards, wallet, and other items. When asked why he'd done it, Gaskin replied, "God said no, the devil said yes. The devil had more of a hold on me than God did."
He's got to be some kind of a crazy person to do something like that.
Was Mr. Gaskin acting under a delusional belief system in that he believed he was a ninja, weird crusade?
Maria Deliberato is with Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty.
Sort of fighting for some...
His great-grandparents who beat him mercilessly. She points to the appeal documents that address abuse and abandonment he suffered as a child.
He's been locked up in the Florida Department of Corrections without a possibility of parole, and that should continue.
Arrest and trial. When the slayings became public, Gaskin became a suspect almost immediately after his girlfriend's cousin implicated Gaskin in the incident, saying that Gaskin came home soon after the slayings and said he was wrapping some presents. Gaskin was arrested soon after the slayings. Initially, he denied any involvement in the incident. However, he later confessed to the slayings and said they were completely random. He confessed in a taped statement to having urges to commit slaughter. He also confessed to slaying a co-worker back in 1986. After a search of Gaskin's home, the presents were determined to be from the Sturmfels property. Local media reported that Gaskin quickly confessed to the crimes and told a psychologist before his trial that he knew what he was doing. The guilt was always there, Gaskin said. The devil had more of a hold on me than God did. I knew that I was wrong. I wasn't insane.
John Koch, an independent journalist, witnessed the moments leading up to Gaskin's execution.
If someone has a mental problem, you don't execute him. You heal him.
While reading his notes, he says Gaskin was calm and didn't look around the room.
You don't see how he's tightly, but you look at the arms. They're wrapped and he's strapped.
After a 2-month trial in July 1990, Gaskin was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree slaying and 2 counts of attempted slaying, and he was given 2 fatal sentences. In 2002, Gaskin unsuccessfully tried to appeal his sentence. He was incarcerated at the Florida State Prison in Rayford, Florida, from his arrest up until his punishment 34 years later. Gaskin's recent punishment. Florida finally fatally punished the Ninja Slayer on 12 April 2023. Gaskin, 56 years old at the time, was pronounced deceased at 6:15 p.m. after receiving a lethal injection, the governor's office said. Gaskin woke up at 4:45 a.m. and had his last meal at 9:45 a.m. The meal included barbecue pork ribs, pork and turkey neck, buffalo wings, shrimp fried rice, french fries, and water. Gaskin was visited by his sister Wednesday, but didn't meet with a spiritual advisor, McLaughlin Smith said.
He died by lethal injection without any complications, according to the prison. Igito says he believes life in prison without parole would have been a better sentence for Gaskin. The victim's family members were not present.
We believe that killing people who kill people to stop people from killing people is silliness.
Prison officials say Louis Gaskin woke up just before 5 a.m., then 3 hours later, and then shortly after 6 o'clock, he was put to death. He received his last meal, and then his sister visited him for the last time.
No relatives of the victims had arranged to be in the witness room during the punishment, which was scheduled for 6 p.m. and started without delay. When asked if he had any final statement, Gaskin said, "Justice is not about the crime, it's not about the criminal, it's about the law." He then referred to the legal proceedings surrounding his case and the appeals and finished his statement saying, "Look at my case."
After spending more than 30 years on Florida's death row, freelance broadcast journalist John Koch has been witnessing state execution since the late 1980s. Convicted murderer Lewis Gaskin was executed by way of lethal injection. He witnessed Gaskin take his last breath.
He quietly went to sleep and he died. This one played out pretty good. And then he asked, the last 4 words of his life was, "Look at my case." He said that basically it's not about the crime or the criminal, it's about the law.
Gaskin began receiving the lethal cocktail of drugs at 6:02 p.m., causing him to breathe heavily as his chest rose and fell under a white sheet. The prison's warden went to check on whether Gaskin was still conscious at 6:05 p.m. He didn't respond. Gaskin's breathing appeared to stop at 6:07 p.m. A doctor entered the chamber at 6:14 p.m. to examine Gaskin and declared him deceased a minute later.
About 50 people who the event organizer says traveled more than 100 miles from Daytona. The group stood across the street from the death chamber expressing their opposition, protested Lewis Gaskin's execution. Gaskin's last words, according to someone who witnessed his execution, were, quote, "Look at my case."
When the clock struck 6 o'clock Wednesday night,
that they are able to hear the bell.
Protesters took turns hitting this bell.
We've been told by people who've been exonerated from death row.
Among the many who protested Gaskin's execution was Father Philip Aguido.
Death warrant for someone's execution, it's done in the name of the people of Florida.
He says he believes killing is wrong.
And we don't want the blood of anyone on us.
Gaskin's punishment came 6 weeks after Donald Dilbeck, 59, was put down for the 1990 slaying of Faye Vann, 44, in Tallahassee, and 3 weeks before the scheduled punishment of Daryl B. Barwick for slaying Rebecca Went, 24, in 1986 in Panama City. Gaskin's demise marked the state's 101st fatal punishment since the reinstatement of the capital punishment in 1976. There are an additional 297 people on Florida's End Row, which is located at Florida State Prison about 40 miles southwest of Jacksonville. The state and U.S. Supreme Courts rejected appeals Gaskin filed since his fatal warrant was signed. The latest denial came a day before his fatal punishment. Richard Glossip is widely recognized as an innocent man marching to his demise after receiving capital punishment for a crime he never committed. How did Richard Glossip get wrapped up in this mess? The crime and sentence. Glossip was sentenced to his demise for the 1997 slaying of Barry Van Treese inside a seedy Best Budget inn that Van Treese owned on the outskirts of Oklahoma City. No physical evidence linked Glossip, the motel's live-in manager, to the crime. Instead, the case against him was built almost exclusively on the testimony of a 19-year-old maintenance man named Justin Sneed, who admitted to bludgeoning Van Treese but said it was all Glossip's idea, claiming that Glossip had promised him money for it. In exchange for testifying against Glossip, Sneed avoided capital punishment and was sentenced to life without parole. One of the key points of contention in Glossip's case is the lack of physical evidence tying him directly to the crime. There were no fingerprints, DNA, or other forensic evidence linking Glossip to the slaying scene. The case primarily relied on Sneed's testimony and circumstantial evidence, such as Glossip's allegedly suspicious behavior after the slaying. Despite the absence of forensic proof, Glossip was found guilty. Glossip insisted on his actual innocence and refused to accept a plea bargain.
Why don't you talk about that? We work in the rule of law here, okay? And let me tell you what.
I have looked at the evidence and I think Richard Glossip's guilty.
Aid to police never included me in anything. I was never included until Memo and them put that.
In July 1998, an Oklahoma jury convicted Glossip of the slaying and sentenced him to his demise. In 2001, the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals unanimously threw out that conviction, calling the case extremely weak and finding Glossip had received unconstitutionally ineffective assistance of counsel. In August 2004, a second Oklahoma jury convicted Glossip of the slaying and sentenced him to his demise. Glossip complained that prosecutors had intimidated his defense attorney into resigning. However, in April 2007, the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals affirmed the sentence, with 2 judges in the majority, 1 judge especially concurring, and 2 judges dissenting. Glossop attracted the advocacy of Sister Helen Prejean, but failed to get the clemency board to consider letters from Sneed's family who believe Sneed is lying. Glossop has always insisted on his innocence, and over the last decade, evidence that he was wrongly convicted has steadily mounted. Much of this evidence supports Glossop's contention that Sneed, a chronic drug user who demonstrated unpredictable bouts of violence, carried out the crime and only later set up Glossop as the mastermind. New witnesses have come forward to counter the state's portrayal of Sneed as a hapless dolt who took direction from Glossop, testifying that Sneed was cunning, manipulative, and quite capable of slaying a man on his own.
I can't stand there and confess to a crime I didn't commit so you can just shove me in a prison somewhere and say, hey, right. I truly had nothing to do with it. I would not have hurt Barry in any way, shape, or form, and I surely wouldn't have.
I've accompanied 6 human beings to execution. Richard would be the 7th man.
He was offering me, kept changing, up to a point to...
Most recently, the state disclosed evidence that Sneed made misstatements at trial that undermined his credibility. While he was in jail, Sneed was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and prescribed lithium to manage it. However, when he testified against Glossop, Sneed denied ever seeing a psychiatrist and said he had no idea why he'd been given lithium. Oklahoma Attorney General Gentner Drummond highlighted these misstatements in his recent brief to the court, seeking to vacate Glossop's conviction. He argued that Sneed's mental health disorder combined with his chronic drug use could have negatively affected Sneed's ability to properly recall key facts at trial. Yet in the end, the state reached the difficult conclusion that the conviction of Glossop was obtained with the benefit of material misstatements to the jury by its key witness. In its opinion, the court dismissed Drummond's conclusions and explained away Sneed's misstatements by speculating that the star witness was more than likely in denial of his mental health disorders. The defense didn't cross-examine Sneed about his diagnosis, the court suggested, because doing so would have demonstrated that he was mentally vulnerable to Glossop's manipulation and control. In rejecting Drummond's request to vacate Glossop's conviction, the court blithely concluded that there was no reason to further stay Glossop's punishment. They said because Glossop has not made the requisite showing of likely success in further appeals or irreparable harm from any denial of his claims, he is not entitled to a stay of punishment. This is not the first time Glossop has come close to the last days of his life.
The Supreme Court halts execution of Oklahoma death row inmate Richard Glossop.
The team has tried to hide everything that they've done. One of the prosecutors, literally, we have it in writing.
We are thrilled that the court granted this stay of execution. This is something that we've been asking for.
Of realization that, hey, finally somebody in the state is listening. And
Glossop's close calls. Glossop has had so many close calls with his fatal sentencing that it is almost unbelievable. On July 1, 2022, Glossop was one of 25 end row inmates to be scheduled for their punishment in Oklahoma. His date was set for September 22, 2022. But on August 16, 2022, Oklahoma Governor Kevin granted him a stay, and his date was moved to December 8, 2022. On November 3, 2022, Governor Stitt again granted a stay for Glossop, allowing time for the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals to address his pending legal proceedings. On January 24, 2023, Glossop's punishment was rescheduled again after Attorney General Gentner Drummond requested a new timetable to accommodate for staff shortages within the Department of Corrections. In March, Drummond announced his office would seek to stay the punishment until 2024 to allow an independent counsel to review the case. After the independent review was released, his office filed a motion to vacate the slaying conviction of Mr. Glossop in April 2023. Drummond did not proclaim Glossop's innocence, but he did note in a news release there was enough doubt of his guilt that the capital punishment and his conviction for the slaying are inappropriate. The case then went back to the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals.
I said I seen him that morning, and I've always said from day one that it was 7:30 the night before.
Punishment, we've become accustomed to there being more, there being a confession, there being videotape. The evidence does not seem to be substantial enough to warrant that, and I believe that's why.
Peter walking on water in the gospel story. I say to him, Richard, you are not going to die.
On April 20, 2023, the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals ruled against Richard Glossop, despite a motion from the state's Attorney General asking the court to vacate Glossop's conviction and remand the case to a lower court. This ruling meant that barring clemency being granted or any further appeals to the U.S. Supreme Court, Glossop would be fatally punished by lethal injection on May 18. In May 2023, Glossop's attorneys filed a petition for a stay to the U.S. Supreme Court, citing new evidence that has come to light, which sheds doubt on the reliability of the state's star witness, Justin Sneed, the man who was convicted of actually carrying out the slaying of Barry Van Treese. Subsequent to this filing, Oklahoma has filed an unopposed response to the petition. On May 5, the Supreme Court halted Glossop's May 18 punishment. Oklahoma Governor Kevin Stitt has indicated that he has taken an oath to follow the law and therefore will not intervene in stopping Glossop's punishment unless the courts step in to act based on either new evidence or procedural error. Glossop has come close to the last day of his life at least 7 times over the period of a few months. The impact of this situation on him mentally cannot be imagined. He has even had his last meal 3 times now and still is fighting against the impending doom of his possible punishment.
Richard Glossop and the justice of his death sentence.
Just understanding that he was a 19-year-old kid under a lot of pressure. And
I'm going to walk in there and I'm going to be fine. I'm going to walk into the death chamber and I'm going to sit down on the gurney of my own opinion, it seems, even though the courts in Oklahoma convicted him of murder.
Controversy on lethal injection. There has been a slew of controversy against the procedure, conduct, and drugs used in Oklahoma's capital punishments. On October 13, 2014, the Oklahoma Attorney General said the state did not have an adequate supply of lethal drugs and delayed the punishment of Glossop and 2 other inmates. A year later, the U.S. Supreme Court halted fatal punishments in Oklahoma until it decided on lethal injection drugs. Governor Mary Fallin stayed Glossop's punishment after the Department of Corrections received potassium acetate instead of potassium chloride, and Glossop's punishment was reset for November 6, 2015. Then, out of nowhere, on October 1, 2015, Governor General Scott Pruitt asked the Court of Criminal Appeals to issue an indefinite stay of all scheduled punishments in Oklahoma, citing the Department of Corrections' acquisition of a drug contrary to protocol. The next day, the request was granted.
Gone through. What your family has gone through, no family should ever have to endure. Did any crime against Barry Van Treese, and I would have never thought of paying anybody to commit.
But there's still time for Governor Stitt to step in and grant Glossop a 60-day stay.
There are very few times that we come to a precipice in our life where what we do.
I must say again for this hearing that I did not know about Justin Sneed's plan to commit against Mr. Van Treese, let alone to murder him. I know that in the chaos, I'm sorry that in my fear and confusion, I caused anyone engaged closely and to take a stand about it.
In a startling situation, it was reported that Oklahoma Corrections Department officials used potassium acetate to punish Charles Frederick Warner on January 15, 2015, contrary to the protocol decided. An attorney representing Glossop and other Oklahoma Endro inmates said logs from Warner's punishment, initialed by a prison staff member, indicated the use of potassium chloride. However, an autopsy report showed 12 vials of potassium acetate were used. Growing support. Glossop, 60 years old now, remains hopeful his life will be spared so he and his wife can continue to build one together, maybe outside the walls of the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. Married just last year, their life together has so far been limited to visits and phone calls. A growing pool of supporters that includes not only his wife and attorneys, but media star and entrepreneur Kim Kardashian, TV talk show host Dr. Phil McGraw, Innocence Project board member Jason Flom, Oklahoma Attorney General Gentner Drummond, and a bipartisan group of 62 Oklahoma legislators are hoping to save his life, pointing to a myriad of questions about his guilt and the process that landed him on the row. After the recent stay of punishment, Glossop's attorney, in a statement, thanked Oklahoma legislators for taking a deeper look at the case and said he was very grateful to the U.S. Supreme Court for doing the right thing in stopping Richard Glossop's unlawful punishment. Legend has held that the first widely recognized female serial slayer in the U.S. is Lavinia Fisher, born in 1793. But the location of her birth, her maiden name, or any information about her childhood is unknown. Historical records do not agree with all of the legends, so perhaps her title is one she may not deserve, but her wickedness definitely cannot be argued. Rumors start spreading. Lavinia grew up to marry a man named John Fisher, and the couple lived near Charleston, South Carolina. The pair made their living operating a hotel called the 6 Mile Wayfarer House. which they managed in the early 1800s. Mysteriously, men who were visiting Charleston began to disappear. As more and more reports were filed with the authorities regarding these missing men, it was determined that they were last seen at the 6 Mile Wayfarer house, which was called such because it was 6 miles outside of Charleston. Though the local authorities began an investigation, there was no evidence that the Fishers were involved. This, coupled with their popularity in the town, led to the investigation being dropped. Lavinia was a beautiful and charming woman, adding to her popularity in the community and the hotel's business. However, it would later be learned that she utilized those characteristics to help her husband rob and destroy many male travelers. And as more and more men went missing, the rumor mill began to do its work. The citizens of Charleston decided they'd had enough. They were not going to let these bandits cause more problems for their city's already struggling economy. They set out on February 16, 1819, a well-armed, organized mob operating under Lynch's law, taking matters into their own hands. A turn of events. The locals soon gathered up a group of vigilantes who went to the Fishers in February 1819 to stop the activities occurring there. Though it is unknown what they may have said or done, they were satisfied with their task and returned to Charleston, leaving one man by the name of David Ross to stand watch in the area. Early the following day, David Ross was ambushed by 2 men and dragged before a group of men along with Lavinia Fisher. He looked to her for help, but instead, she choked him and smashed his head through a window. Somehow, Ross was able to escape and alert authorities. At nearly the same time, John Peoples traveled from Georgia to Charleston and, tired from his long trip, stopped at the 6 Mile house to see if they had a room. He was warmly greeted by the beautiful Lavinia, who informed him they didn't have a room available, but invited him in for tea and a meal. Her company was so pleasant that he ignored Lavinia's husband's odd glances at him and chatted with her, answering her every question. When she excused herself from the table for a moment, she returned with tea and good news. A room had suddenly become available if John still wanted it. He accepted, and Lavinia poured him a cup of tea. John didn't like tea but didn't want to seem impolite, so instead of refusing it or leaving it untouched, he poured it out when she wasn't looking. Afterward, she showed him to his room. He then began to wonder why she had asked him so many questions. Why was her husband staring at him all evening? Suddenly, he felt uncomfortable with all the information he had provided and worried he might become a target for robbery. Feeling safer in the chair by the door than in the bed, he dozed until a loud noise awakened him. Looking around, he realized that the bed he should have been sleeping in had disappeared into a deep hole beneath the floor. John quickly jumped out the window, got on his horse, and fled to authorities in Charleston. Police then arrested John and Lavinia Fisher, as well as 2 men they had been operating with. The 6 Mile Wayfarer house was thoroughly searched, and the grounds were dug up. Filled with hidden passages, the sheriff reportedly found items that could be traced to dozens of travelers, a tea laced with an herb that could put someone to sleep for hours, a mechanism that could be triggered to open the floorboards beneath the bed, and in the basement, as many as 100 sets of remains. Trial and sentencing. The Fishers pleaded not guilty but were ordered to stay in jail until their trial. In the meantime, their co-conspirators were released on bail. At their trial in May, the jury didn't agree with their innocent plea, found them guilty of multiple robberies and slayings, and sentenced them to hang. However, they were given time to appeal the conviction. During the wait, they occupied themselves, making a plan to escape. Housed together in a jail that was not heavily guarded, they began making a rope from jail linens. On September 13, they put their plan in place and used the rope to drop down to the ground. John made it out, but the rope broke, leaving Lavinia trapped in the cell. Not willing to go without his wife, he returned to the jail, and the 2 were afterward kept under much tighter security. In February 1820, the Constitutional Court rejected their appeal, and their fatal punishment was scheduled for later that month. A local minister named Reverend Richard Furman was sent in to counsel the pair if they so wished. John freely talked to Furman and is said to have begged the priest to save his soul, if not his life. However, the cruel Lavinia would have nothing to do with him. On the morning of February 18, 1820, the Fishers were taken from the Charleston jail to be hanged on the gallows behind the building. John Fisher went quietly praying with the minister, whom he had asked to read a letter. Before a crowd of some 2,000 people, the letter insisted on his innocence and asked for mercy for those who had done him wrong in the judicial process. He then began to verbally plead his case before the gathered crowd, but he asked for their forgiveness before he was hanged. Lavinia did not go so quietly. She had requested to wear her wedding dress, and refusing to walk to the gallows, had to be picked up and carried as she ranted and raved. Before the crowd, she continued to scream pointedly at the Charleston socialites, who she blamed for encouraging a conviction. Before her punishers could tighten the noose around her neck, she yelled into the crowd, "If you have a message you want to send to hell, give it to me. I'll carry it." Then, before they could finish the job, she jumped off the scaffold herself. Not quite reaching the ground, she dangled down to the crowd. Later, onlookers would say they had never seen such a wicked stare or chilling sneer as that which was on the 27-year-old Lavinia's face. Though many sources say that the Fishers were buried in the Unitarian Church graveyard between King and Archdale Streets in Charleston, this is highly unlikely. There was a Pottersfield cemetery next to the jail at the time, where most criminals were buried if family members didn't claim their bodies. Additionally, church records have been searched, indicating no evidence that she was buried there. Tour guides have likely perpetuated this tale. The ghost of Lavinia Fisher. It should come as no surprise with a terrible story such as this that the ghost of Lavinia is said to still roam in Charleston. Almost immediately following her end, locals began to report seeing her face floating behind the window bars where she was held. Then, after the great earthquake of 1886, people began to report her wandering around in other parts of the neighborhood, as well as the Unitarian Cemetery just a few blocks away. The old jail building served as the Charleston County Jail from its construction in 1802 until 1939. Way back in 1680, when the city of Charleston was being laid out, a 4-acre square of land was set aside at this location for public use. In time, a hospital, a poorhouse, a workhouse for runaway slaves, and a jail were built on the square. The first structures were erected on the site in 1738, when the property was used as a workhouse for runaway slaves and a makeshift hospital for paupers, vagrants, and beggars. Criminals were also housed here before the old jail building was erected, though they were kept separate from non-offenders. Punishments also took place at this location. Criminals faced whippings, brandings, torture, and deprivation of food and water. For horse thieves, their ears were sometimes nailed to a post before finally being sliced off altogether. The worst offenders might be burned at the stake, hanged, or drawn and quartered. Over the years, numerous structures were built, demolished, and rebuilt. In the 137 years that the building was in operation, it served as a jail and an asylum, housing a great variety of inmates, including John and Lavinia Fisher. Today, the Old City Jail is an official Save America's Treasures project of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and efforts to restore and maintain the building are ongoing. Reports of strange occurrences began with the restoration efforts in 2000. One of the first reports was workers finding footprints in the dust after the building had been locked off for months due to lead paint contamination. Others have reported seeing a man in ragged clothing wandering aimlessly in the halls. Thought to be the spirit of a former slave, the man is seemingly unaware of the living or his surroundings. But the old jail's most famous ghost is that of the cruel slayer Lavinia Fisher. Several who have visited the historic building often claim to have seen the woman in her wedding dress, describing it as bright red and white. That's all for today's video. See you next time.